discussing various issues and questions related to the state of China studies in India today and what can be done, what are the prospects for the future. So those of you who were listening to the first session, first special panel on the 28th, which was on research methods in China studies, you may find that some of the themes that were flagged in that session are going to be picked up in this session, which is almost the concluding session of the conference also. So before I introduce our panelists, I would like to make a couple of brief remarks. The Institute of Chinese Studies, to which I belong, has just completed a preliminary survey and assessment of developments that have taken place in China studies in India in the last 10 to 15 years. And for those of you who are interested, the report is available on the ICS website. Now, I'd just like to point out two things that really stand out from that survey, from the conclusions of that survey. So one is that there has been a definite expansion of China studies here in recent times, in the last 10 to 15 years. And by expansion, we mean not just the number of students or scholars or the number of centers, but also we mean a geographical expansion, out of the traditional centers like Delhi, Calcutta, Shantiniketan, Banaras to newer areas. And there's also been an expansion from public to private institutions and universities. So in fact, three of our invited panelists today all belong to some of these newer centers or programs that have been initiated really in the last 10 to 15 years. But the second thing that I would like to draw attention to is that in spite of this expansion, there remain huge constraints in taking forward this momentum of building up China studies in India, and that these constraints relate both to the inadequacy of resources for a specialized study of China, and it also relates to a lack of clear policy or direction on how to go ahead and build up Chinese studies in India. So certain things are happening in some place, other things are happening in other places, and some things are going backwards, there is regression. So what we really sort of need is a much clearer view on how the China studies community as well as the government, other stakeholders can work together to take it forward. So this is just to sort of kind of, you could say, set the tone, and it's not meant to inhibit what our panelists are going to say today. Now, before we I introduce our panelists today, we have a couple of unforeseen developments. One is that, Mr. Naveen Srivastava, who is the Joint Secretary, East Asia in the Ministry of External Affairs, he was expected to be a panelist today, but unfortunately, he has been called away on official duty, and we will miss his presence here today. And also, and this is most unfortunate, Dr. Dhriti Roy from Sikkim University, who was to be here, has suffered a personal bereavement today, this morning, and she too cannot be here today. So let me begin the introductions with Dr. Sonika Gupta, who is from a co-host institution of this AICCS, that is IIT Madras, where she is Associate Professor of Global Politics at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. She was a founder of the IITM China Studies Center in 2011, and she was its coordinator from 2011 to 2015. Is that right? Yeah, okay. And next we have Dr. G. Venkat Raman, who's on the faculty of the Indian Institute of Management at Indore, from the Humanities and Social Sciences Department since 2015, before which he was at the sister institution IIM Kozhikode in Kerala from 2010. And before that, he had spent 7 years in China earning his doctoral degree from Peking University, and he has also worked in the corporate world there. So incidentally, both Dhriti and Venkat have been key organizers for earlier editions of the AICCS, which were held at Gangtok and at Kozhikode, respectively. Then we have our third panelist is Professor Tansen, who is Professor of History and the Director of the Center for Global Asia at NYU Shanghai, and also the Global Network Professor at NYU in New York. So many of you will be familiar with his articles and books, which are really, most of them are really landmarks in the scholarship on China-India interactions. Of these, I'll just mention two. One is his monograph on Buddhism, diplomacy, and trade, the realignment of Sino-Indian relations 600 to 1400, which was published back in 2003. And more recently, a rather magisterial survey of India-China connections called India, China, and the World, A Connected History. So I would also like to add that he is an institution builder, and he has always taken a keen interest in the development of Chinese studies here in India. So we have a total of about 90 minutes, if I'm right, in this session, of which I would like to reserve about 40 minutes, if we can, for audience participation. Because I think this is an issue on which many of those who are listening would have something to say or would like to intervene in some way. So those who would like to ask questions, may I request you to please use the chat box so that we can club questions if necessary, if there is a shortage of time. So that gives us about 45 minutes for the discussion among the panelists. So I would be grateful if you could limit your initial responses to each question to about 5 minutes or so that we can cover more issues and we can come back again and again. Okay, so let me begin by asking Sonika, rather provocatively, that if you had to name only one major challenge that is faced, that we face in developing China studies in India today, what would you say? What would you respond?
Thank you, Professor Thampi, and thank you, IICCS, for inviting me to talk about this issue, which I think is something that we all have stake in. And I'm sure there will be a number of different views on what is the state of China studies and how we could kind of address some of the things that we think are issues in producing better scholarship on China. And I think two of these issues where there would be a widespread agreement is that language training, of course. And I think we also have to recognize that you cannot flag the state of academic training on China without talking about the state of academic training generally in universities. Now, if we were to take these as two given conditions that we all might agree with, beyond this, what is it that one can point as something that we should think about or something we might consider a problem? And I would say, to my mind, one of the things that hampers a solid, grounded study of China in India is the fact that the concerns of China studies scholars and the concerns of China studies programs in India, they use primarily a bilateral lens. And this lens is largely looking at China studies in a securitized way. So when we have a lot of institutional, academic, personal investment in looking at the India-China equation as the primary focus, it tends to sometimes lead us down some academic dead ends. This is not to say that any study of bilateral relations between India and China will necessarily produce this result. But in India, it has produced certain very specific outcomes. And I'd like to talk about this in a few points. I think one thing that has happened is that because the larger concern is a bilateral concern, there hasn't been an understanding, or there's a lack of appreciation about Chinese history as a bedrock of building a sound understanding of China. And there is intellectual incuriosity or lack of curiosity about China, about Indian history in China and Chinese history in India. Of course, the state of India studies in China is a completely different matter. But what does the direction of China studies since the establishment of India as an independent country and the People's Republic of China? What does it say for the way we have looked at how to actually go about not engaging with each other, but understanding, which is a much more fundamental process. So one could say that there are certain things that have overshadowed building of an understanding of China as a process rather than as a neighbor. And some of this you saw in the reform period, in the post-reform period in India. So when the economic reforms happened in India, there was this whole flurry of academic work that came out that started looking at India and China comparisons without sufficiently engaging with the question that why deploy a comparative lens at all? What is comparable? I mean, the fact that we are large populations, we are diverse populations, the fact that the nature of poverty differs or is similar, quite apart from these things, there was a specific political history of China, which is different from India, specific institutional space, a very different nature of protest in China. All of this did not make its way into these comparisons. And because the lens was a bilateral lens, a lot of it was hijacked by how can we catch up with China? And the second part, which I think was, personally, I feel that it's the most damaging part, is what can we learn from China? And I think that has not gone away. What can we learn from China has actually not gone away. And it has led work on China, whether it's academic work or policy work, into directions which are completely and wholly ahistorical in nature, without paying sufficient attention to how China is positioned within its own history at different junctures of time. And I think what we have also lost sight of the fact, or never have arrived at that understanding, is that today China is at the place, a very similar place to what the United States was after the Second World War, which means every decision that China takes affects the rest of the world, regardless of what the nature of your relationship as a country or as a people with China is. So it doesn't even matter whether you have diplomatic relations with China or not. It doesn't matter whether you are doing trade with China or not. The decisions China makes affects the setup within which you have to function. This is, of course, not to say there is no sense of agency, or there shouldn't be a sense of agency, but to understand that there are structural conditions that underlie decisions that China takes. And these structural conditions are an outcome of an interplay of Chinese domestic politics and its foreign policy. We focus largely on the outcomes and look at the outcomes as a given, as a granted, given as, our understanding of it begins at a level where it doesn't allow us to understand or exploit in an academic sense critically how China has reached that outcome. And I think we can all agree that the study of China and India is largely dominated by people who are trained in international relations. And people who have worked in positions of responsibility in dealing with China. So a lot of the academic work actually has, through this bilateral lens and sometimes a fairly nationalistic lens, moved into policy analysis rather than academic analysis. So I think we need to really relook at this bilateralism that I would say clouds our lens on China and understand China for the global process today that it is. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Sonika. I think you've made two very important points about, how looking at China mainly through the bilateral lens or the bilateral perspective actually prevents us from looking at China in its context, both in a time sense, history, as well as in its location in the world and what it's doing, as well as the relationship between domestic politics in China, domestic situation in China, and what it does on a global scale. I mean, that's a very important point, as well as the domination of the IR perspective. Okay, and these are things we will come back to, I think. But I would like to address the same question which I asked Sonika to Venkat about if you feel, what would you feel is the main constraint or challenge in front of China studies here today? And if you want to also comment on anything that Sonika raised.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, fine. Yeah, I mean, very nice comments, Sonika. I mean, I could, appreciate where she is coming from. So I'll straight away come to the challenges. I think we already had a very challenging task in our hands, but the recent incidents, unfortunately, have made the challenge much, much more challenging. In many of the scholars like Professor Tansen and all who have written about China studies in India, they look at 1962 as a watershed kind of episode. Now, the kind of impact it has had. What I really, and I'm so sure many others feel, is what kind of impact 15th June is going to have in this China studies. I mean, the spirit which the Rajiv Gandhi visit started, it went on in one way or the other till the Wuhan and the Mamallapuram, summits. But suddenly all the good work vanishes away. Now, how do we get back that goodwill which we found it so difficult to arrive at? I think that is a huge, huge challenge. Why do I say that? Because that has completely played such a spoil sport in disintegrating whatever kind of understanding, some basic understanding we managed to arrive at as far as different stakeholders are concerned, whether it is business or whether it is government or whether it is track to people to people. People were ready to get on, and then this happens. So getting this back, and once again, devoting our energies to this whole process of China studies in India is going to be a humongous task. As this has gone, China virus, so-called, what Americans have called coronavirus, in the last 1 year, suddenly, there seems to be a certain kind of tremendous amount of negativity, and, Galwan has just added fuel to fire. So our challenge is, the biggest challenge which I see is, how do we deal with this kind of a dualism? And what is that dualism? The dualism is of the inevitability of accepting China, which is a superpower today, and yet at the same time, non-accepting it. So to give you an example, how do we deal with the fact that, if there is a certain kind of impact on export of APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients from China to India, paracetamol price shoots up 40%. So is that acceptable to us? Are we ready to take that challenge? No, we are not ready. So we would like that to happen. So that is acceptance, a very basic example. Non-acceptance, 58 apps banned. That is, we cannot accept that China is, doing what it is doing in India, and so therefore we would like to punish. So how do we deal with this acceptance and non-acceptance at the same time? That is something which is going to be very, very difficult to contend with. So the third challenge is, which I was thinking about it, and I was just reading the preface of Prasenjit Dwara and Liz Perry's book. And they have very nice, terms. One is basically what they call, how do we basically have between India and China studies, quote unquote, what they call convergent comparison. And then they said that earlier it was victim to methodological nationalism, quote unquote, and how we can move from methodological nationalism to convergent comparison. I think as the movement is being spoken about, that, this is something which, touches some kind of a chord with what Sonika was saying, that go out from national historical narratives and see how various global and local actors, converge in different nodes, if one can say so, in India and China, study them, study the commonalities, and then get ahead and try to make sense of what is happening. But unfortunately, we have seemed to be going on a back gear. How do we, once again, nationalism narrative all over the world, it is a major challenge now. And again, India and China, but Corona has just added some more fuel to this already existing fire of nationalism. So this is a huge challenge. How do we get back that? And number three, that is something which I always say, but I don't understand how obvious things can be and still you look the other way. And that is, and I would like to quote, there are a lot of reports in the West now which says that, American students, Westerners are getting their interest less and less on China. So in this context, Robert Daly, I would like to quote him. He was the director of a Kissinger Institute in the United States. And he was very much concerned about this development. And the same pertains, he kind of voiced concerns which, echo my sentiments here. And what did he say? He said, quote unquote, we can't respond coherently, effectively, and fully to China unless we understand China in its own terms, That is something which is very critical. So that is one. And second is, understand China not because we are being benevolent to China or benevolent to the world. Understand China because it is for something of our own national interest. You always find it worthy of investing on a friend to get more benefits, to further, have intimacy with a friend. But if someone you think is an adversary, all the more reasons to know that person. So if India has to sing its song of modernity, then it has no other choice but to understand and invest on China. Now, how do we make the different stakeholders understand this? I think this is such a huge challenge. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Venkat has raised this elephant in the room, which is the developments during the last 1 year and the kind of general negativity that has been spread about Chinese studies, so that it's not like the earlier period, things were so, going so well, but now we see we are sort of on the defensive a bit in, when we come to. So anyway, that is also an important point. Tansen, would you like to also address the same question as well as respond to issues raised by both Sonika and Venkat?
Yeah, I would address some of the issues that Sonika and Venkat pointed out. I think those are important issues, but I would like to thank Ambassador Kanta for inviting me to this forum. I think IICCS has been doing extremely good work with these annual conferences, but also other issues related to China in the last several years. And also, I think all of us should thank Madhavi for actually looking at the issue of China studies. I don't remember, Madhavi, was it 2005 or 2006 when you first published an article on or did a report on China studies in India? And then since then, I mean, you have been working very hard on that. And I was mentioning to you before we started this is that report had, I think, an implication about what happened at DU with regard to curriculum. And bringing two disciplines of Chinese language and Chinese studies together. I think that was an important step. I think that should have been continued in other places as a model in JNU and other places which are establishing new China studies program. I think I've seen the China studies program in India for a long time. I think there is this separation between language and studies. And DU tried to bring that together. But going back to what Sonika said with regard to the bilateral lens, and I think this is a major issue. So I don't know if people have seen this article that I recently wrote on the state of China-India studies in the Journal of Asian Studies. basically trying to argue that China studies is not the same as China-India studies. And the bilateral lens that Sonika was pointing out is sort of China-India studies, but still doesn't get to that. So if you remember, Minister Jaishankar in his keynote address pointed out, if you are going to do international relations, China-India, you have to study and understand Indian policy making, right? So you can't neglect the India side of it if you are doing China-India. Bilateral lens is fine, but really have an Indian perspective as well. It's not just China. So I think if you want to do the bilateral lens or China-India, the bar is much higher. You have to do what I think Kamal Sheel was also pointing out. Look at the Indian language sources. We have lots of sources in Hindi and Bengali, Gujarati on China. If you really want to do that, study India and then use the bilateral lens. So I think one issue has been, yes, the bilateral lens has been used, but actually without looking at the Indian side, unfortunately. So that's one method, I would say, if you want to do that. You really need to do what Sonika actually also pointed out. How do we actually compare to these two countries? How do we look at the connections? And Venkat mentioned how Liz Perry and Prasenjit Dwara have talked about one way of bringing comparison and connections together. And I offer my views as well about how to do that in this article in Journal of Asian Studies, if you want to do China-India studies. Now, if this panel is about China studies, I think we are talking about something very different. And again, emphasizing what Sonika has pointed out, we should look at China, forget about India, first of all, and look at China from its own sources, not look at the interpretations that have been given by Chinese scholars, American scholars, European scholars. Can we come up with our own perspective? And here, if you read the introduction to this new volume that we edited with the contributions by Madhavi and Kamal Sheel, called Beyond Pan-Asianism, we talk about a Taiwanese scholar called Chen Guangxian, who urges Chinese scholars who are studying China to look at India as method, right? Can we study China through the lens of India? This is his part of argument that he says we should decolonize Chinese studies or China studies, take it out of European and American perspective. I think we should also do some kind of analysis about what is the method that we need in order to study China, not from a European or American perspective, but perhaps from an Indian perspective, not going into the bilateral lens perspective, but can we develop a method to study China that is of huge implications to the Indian scholars and the policy makers, right? So I don't think that discourse has taken place. And the reason for that, I think, is obvious. We do not read Chinese sources. In this article we wrote in the Indian Express, we pointed out that there's hardly any historians of China in India. That's pretty sad. Dhriti, who couldn't join us today, is one of the few scholars who knows classical Chinese. And if you are studying China before 1949, you have to deal with these kinds of classical Chinese, traditional Chinese characters and so forth. Why aren't we training students in that way? And to learn and use Chinese language sources, historical sources, before we get to contemporary modern Chinese language sources. But also, how do we use the data from China? If you are doing a comparative or studying Chinese economy, how and where do we go for data? What economic data is reliable or not? So this has to do with the basic issue about how do we analyze sources in the historical sense, data in the contemporary sense. So I think these are issues that we need to talk about, is how do we do China studies and forget the India part or the bilateral lens part to begin with, and focus on how China must be studied.
Okay, thank you. I want to raise that issue of Chinese language and Chinese sources, because every time we have a discussion, it seems to be an insoluble problem here. What we found in our survey is there's a much larger number of people who are actually learning Chinese. And they're learning Chinese in ways which we could not, my generation, let's say, could not about 30 years ago, which is really spend time in China, speak with native speakers. So I would say that, there is a much larger number of people who are learning Chinese, and they're pretty good at it also. I mean, they speak Chinese quite well. But why does it not reflect in the scholarship? Because if you see Chinese studies at a global level, I mean, it's like an absolute, there is no China studies without being competent. They're using the Chinese language. Now, where are we falling short here? We talk about it a lot. We are learning and teaching Chinese, but it doesn't reflect in the scholarship done on China and India. Maybe, do we have any, Sonika, do you have any thoughts on that?
This is what I was trying to flag right in the beginning, that, given, let's say that China scholars in India were actually trained sufficiently well in the language, would that actually address the direction of China studies in India? What is the purpose with which we study China? I think we have to understand two interrelated things which should reflect in our university programs. One is that study of language takes time to nurture and takes even more time to reach a particular level of fluency, to do research in that language, to access archival sources in that language. And if you have sufficient language training, it doesn't necessarily translate into academic training. So this is something in our university programs, wherever we are teaching China studies, there is a kind of a separation between the people who are learning the language and the people who want to do research on China. In JNU, that's the case. In Delhi University, it's a much closer relationship, but there is a very clear understanding that you're doing language. This part of it is that you're doing your language training. We don't do language training in any university program in India that culminates into a research program on China for 5 years or more. There's no anthropological work. There is no anthropological work from India on China. None. And I actually looked. History is something which we have all flagged that we don't understand. You could say, it's very difficult to get access to archival sources in China. It's very difficult to, access classical Chinese because we don't have sufficient training. You don't have current anthropological work in China. Why? We don't have sufficient curiosity about China beyond the border issue. I think if I were to put it in a very, very, I would say, unvarnished way, that's what I would say. And that is what actually confounds me as well. Why is it like that? So then let's look at a broader understanding of how people in India look at Indian foreign policy, India's, view of itself in the world. Is this an incuriosity which is built in with regard to other neighbors as well, with other large partners like the United States? I don't think so. I think we have a systematic building in of a very binary reaction towards China, which is either you can trust China or you cannot trust China. And this is a reflection, I would say, sticking my neck out a little bit, of the firefighting foreign policy approach that India has taken for decades altogether towards China. That we have constantly been fighting one fire after the other rather than coming up with some kind of an approach to identifying what the issue is and identifying from our point of view how we want to resolve that issue. And this translates into then people who dominate institutional and academic positions, who have this experience of dealing with China, where mistrust is very deeply built in. And the same thing happened, you can see, in the IR part of India's studies on the United States. The nuclear issue overshadows the fact that India was sanctioned after the first Pokhran tests, it overshadows analysis of US foreign policy. After the 1 to 3 agreement, you see some kind of almost some kind of a switch to saying now India and China and India and US are natural allies. That's not happened in the case of India and China, but I'm not saying that's how it should be. I'm saying this is the approach towards studying our large partners. And this is what we should actually confront before we can produce any kind of a systematic change in the way in the reason we study China and the process we deploy to study it.
Okay, Sonika, you've made two really, I think, again, two really important points. One is that about this general lack of curiosity, which about China and maybe about other societies, which at least some other societies, maybe societies in our neighborhood also. I think there was one time when Patricia Oberoi, I think she's here in this meeting, where she has raised this point before about a sort of innate lack of curiosity about other societies and studying other societies clearly. That is one point. But the other is that it's so dominated by mistrust that, even to study China, you have to deal with this big monkey on the back, which is the mistrust of China. And that sort of warps the way we look at China. So I think those are two, very important things. Venkat, you have talked before a lot, including in, I think, last January's workshop, that it's hard to interest, let's say, people in doing other disciplines or in other fields of study like management. It's hard to interest them in China or to take the study of China seriously. Am I right? And would you like to expand on that a bit, especially in the light of what Sonika has just said?
Yeah, I think one thing which actually struck, when Sonika was speaking was, she said that the kind of lack of curiosity which is seen vis-a-vis China, that is, we don't see that vis-a-vis other countries. So there must be something very specific about China. So as far as Indian mindset is concerned. So what is that mindset? I am saying something which many people may not like, and I'm saying this purely on the basis of hunch. I don't have numbers, I don't have data. Somewhere down the line, I feel that, there is this kind of feeling that that we both are having civilizational past, and we got our independence in 47, China got its liberation in 49, and mid 60s, both of us were having equal development parameters. In fact, we were doing better. And then suddenly, China comes off like anything. I think somewhere down the line, there is a mixture of awe and envy, I suppose, which it gets translated into a very hesitant kind of an acceptance that they have arrived. I believe that one of the most important ways to approach this is actually having a very deeper understanding, to shed this emotional baggage and look at China the way it is, and then look at it in a way where we start dealing with this juggernaut, which is China. You cannot refuse, wish away that. That is something which it's a huge challenge. Now, coming back to, my own system, it has taken me more than 10. Now, before that, we talk of so much of language, we talk of so much of need for cultural exchange, fellowships and all that. Again, I'm sorry if I'm making it a private conversation, bringing in my private experiences, but I spent 7 years in China, and I had to learn the language. I defended my thesis in Mandarin. It took so much of effort, I would say. Sorry for being so immodest. I come back to China, and I don't have even a single university department ready to accept me. When you don't have any other having that kind of a background. So in the process, here is a person who is a product of a cultural exchange program between India and China, has the benefit of studying, interacting with Chinese. And how does our system, benefit? And I had no takers. People used to ask me that, why are you in IIMs? I'm in IIM because IIM was the only one who actually put its bet on me. Because I was an untouchable that time. Wherever I have applied till today, I haven't even got an acknowledgement that yes, we have received your application. So what have you done with a certain investment which already has been made, which is a very rare thing? Now we are talking about, investing on something which we are not even seeing. So I think we need to somewhere find, need to basically understand that where do we invest. I'm not saying that I am so great or something. I am a product of the cultural exchange program between India and Chinese government. The HRD ministry has sent me. I have come back. I would love to give back to the system, but how do I give it back? I don't know. So I thought IIMS was the only one. I applied, they called me and they selected me, and it has taken me 10 years for me to make people understand here the importance of China. And who are the people who have understood the importance of China? No one except my students, thankfully. And when did it take off? When did it took off? It took off big time when 2 years back, I took a group of students to China, showed them, this is what is Shanghai, this is what is China. It was just a 5-day visit. I asked them to write a tour diary. And one of the students wrote such a moving tour diary. And I quote her. She said that as we were taking off from Shanghai and flying away from, Shanghai towards our home, I was not very sure whether I'm flying to my home or I'm flying away from my home. This is the kind of impact, it had. And they come and tell their students, and I increase the number of credits from 2 credits to 3 credits, doing business with China. And unfortunately, the momentum which was built, Corona comes and plays a spoil sport. Now again, back to square one. And in fact, many students told me that, we regretted the 4th term here is a very competitive one. And in that, if someone is spending 3 credits, they were told me that, sir, we regretted that, Corona has come and now 3 credits are going to get wasted. But once the course was done, fortunately, they, said that, no, sir, we thought that it's okay. And I'm sure. So it has taken 10 years for something which is very obvious. Now, what is the role of the ecosystem? I mean, in our IIM system, it is said that, students do the bidding. Yeah, students do the bidding. But what is the difference between students are, myopic in certain ways. It is the job of the institution, the leadership to anticipate how the world is changing few years down the line and bring in certain kind of feelers where students are encouraged to make right kind of choices. And if they still choose to make the wrong choices, that is their headache. We don't do that. I know many of my learned colleagues here, I'm sorry to say, they said that, dekho, ab to corona aa gaya, ab tum band karo, doing business with China, kya hoga? It's funny. So, how do we deal with this? And apart, I was reading somewhere, really, according to McKinsey report, 2030, urban consumption, for every dollar of urban consumption all over the world in 2030, 12 cents of urban consumption will be in China itself. 38% of textile and apparel consumption is already there. So when so much is happening in the world of business, we just look the other way around and we say that, no, we are not going, this is something which, is not something desirable. And then some of my students, as I said last year, they take doing business with China, not because China is important. They take it because they like, some tidbits which I do with my ethics course. Although it gives me some kind of a satisfaction, but I would rather have them come to China because of what importance China has in their own careers down the line. So in this last 10 years, I had to experiment with I started with doing business in China. Then people said, no, doing business in BRICS might be better. I did doing business in BRICS. It did not capture the attention. Then said, no, doing business in emerging markets. And then all that I needed to do was, just tick off the in, and I said, doing business with China. What does it mean to do business with China? And that kind of a business is not necessarily you go and invest there. It can be cultural engagement, it can be political engagement, it can be. And, so fortunately the course is taking shape now. And as I started, building some kind of, energy, and now suddenly this happens. And now I'm again dealing with how do I package this course so that the China word is not, leading to some kind of an antagonism. The loss is students. I mean, so, one person can only do this much. There is such an important role the leadership has to play. And I don't see that happening. Fortunately, I see at least, some of my very modest efforts, it has touched chord with, students. So I'm very hopeful that this momentum will be there.
Thank you.
So I'm sorry, I got carried away by my emotion or something,
No,
but I think these are the stories which actually tell you the reality.
Okay, I think also you touched on this issue of even when we produce scholars or produce people through various mechanisms that have been put up, do we find a use for them actually in India? I mean, I find that very painful because it takes a lot to produce let's say a PhD scholar with the requisite capabilities, but then they really struggle. Maybe they struggle in other societies too. I know in the US also people struggle once they come out with their PhDs, but here, like even a very few who come through, it's a hit and miss kind of chance. And maybe that's one reason why many students don't want to invest that amount of time, the number of years it takes to learn Chinese to the requisite level, because at the end of it all, if you spend all that time and somebody else who has spent much less time gets a job because they fit with the paradigm or they fit with the narrative, whatever is desired. So that's a real problem. Tansen, any response to what
initially, I think you pointed out that the quality of Chinese language knowledge has increased tremendously in India. I mean, I've engaged with Indian students coming to China since the 1980s, and we have a number of young Indian scholars, students whose Chinese language is really very good. But we should not expect all of them to get into China studies. I think it's fine for them to go and work in businesses and so forth. That's okay. I mean, the issue is if we can find 5 out of 100 students who are interested in China studies, then are we offering them the kinds of courses they need in order to understand the Chinese language in a different way? It's not Chinese language for conversation purposes, but Chinese for research purposes, which is very different. So when I was doing my PhD in the US, we had to learn 2 years of Japanese language because Japanese scholars had written about Chinese history, and we had to read a Japanese language scholarship. But that was not enough. These 2 years of Japanese language were for conversation purposes. So we had another course called Japanese for China Scholars. So how do you actually read Japanese to study Japanese language works on China? So this was for research purposes. I don't think we have that kind of a course in India that would say, okay, now that you have learned Chinese for 3 years, how do you use that language training to actually critically analyze Chinese language writings? Or even if you are doing an interview, how do you organize the interview? So that is a special course for those interested in doing research. I think that's what is missing in many of the language programs that we have in India. How do you go ahead and use that language that you are good in to actually work on the sources? And the sources can be written or oral or data and so forth. So that connection, I think, is missing, that bridge course between Chinese language and China studies. And then we are not targeting everybody. Not everybody would be interested in that kind of a course. But if we can offer that, I think that will be tremendously important. So I would suggest that those people who are doing language and studies, and there are a few in India, should try to think of that kind of course and introduce it into the curriculum. And perhaps even those who have graduated with Chinese language and want to do China studies now, maybe there should be refresher courses for them as well, to see how, now that you know how to read Chinese and speak Chinese, can we now move to how do we use the language as a tool to do research, which is a different thing than going into business and interpreting or working as a tour guide, which is good. But I think we have to train researchers in a different way and not leave it to them to get trained. I mean, I think that's the other issue that's missing, is the guidance that is needed for the young scholars who are good in language to then move into studies.
I think so, because, frankly, I think that we have those kind of teachers who can train, in JNU, for instance, who can train scholars in how to read Chinese sources and use them for the research. But one problem, as you said, is there are very few students who would go for that, mainly because they get absorbed. But as you pointed out, it's quite all right for 95 out of 100 students to go into other fields. But if those 5 are there, who are interested, it sort of reminds me of what happened with us in our MPhil course, which we had in DU when I was there, where we had a lot of optional courses for students who wanted to, and we had a rule that you had to have a minimum of 5 people who wanted to opt for a course for a teacher to take that course. And I remember that very boldly one year I offered a course in Qing history, and and there were 2 students, MPhil students, who wanted that course. And, because there were only 2 names on that list, it wasn't offered. And, they went to our head of department and said that, what do? We want to study Qing history, but that course is not being offered. And so she had the, I would say the vision or whatever it was. She said, if your teacher is willing to teach 2 students, then you can go ahead and have that course. So they came, she said, ask. So they came and asked, will you teach it for just 2 of us? And I said, sure. I was so happy that there were 2 students for the first time in my life who wanted to study Qing history. And, out of those 2, one is pursuing now Qing history in University of Toronto. He got interested enough, and let's see, hopefully he will go well with that. So the point is that there may be very few, but we have to give them that extra training and not look in which may mean years of doing extra work with that. But that's what
that commitment has to be there. But I think one of the other issues, Madhavi, and this is what we have been talking about since we met at DU, is that it's not just a problem of people doing and teaching China studies, it's also the disciplines which are not integrating China into their curriculum. Like the history department and DU, if you remember, we tried very hard to bring them in and see if they could offer courses on China, or this is the same issue with anthropology as well. Are the departments doing sociology and anthropology interested in introducing a China component to it? So the reason I think all this time we haven't really succeeded in developing China studies as we wanted to is because we haven't sold it to these other disciplines, political science, history, and sociology and anthropology. Unless they buy into that idea that China part is important, I don't think we'll make any inroads into the larger pool of scholars interested in China. So I think that's another structural issue that needs to be resolved. It's not just talking among ourselves, those who do China, but talking with people who do history as a discipline, anthropology as a discipline, see if there can be courses that can be co-taught or perhaps research programs that are started in other departments. And this is why you have in the US and other places, not only East Asian Studies or China Studies department, but history department would have people doing China, or anthropology department or religion department would have people doing Chinese religion. So it's not that only the East Asian Studies people are doing East Asia. Other departments are also doing East Asia, China in particular. So that kind of a dialogue, I think, is long due.
Yes, I think so. Okay.
Madhavi ma'am, I want to just, Madhavi ma'am, if it's okay, I would like to just
brief and then we.
Yeah. So, when we are talking about China studies in India, the kind of discussions that we are going, it's very, very important. Language, research, sources. But I think as we become ambitious, which is very, very important, we also need to know that everyone is not going to aspire to become a sinologist. There are undergrads, postgrad degrees, IITs are there, IIMs are there in India. In whatever limited way can we expose students to China? That is something which is very critical. I'll give you an example. In our system, now doing business with China course comes in 4th term. 3 years back, I taught students the same course in 6th term, which is the final term. Okay. And by then, most of the core courses, a wide range of electives on the basis of case method and all that, it is over. But you won't believe, many of the people here won't believe that the kind of cases, very common cases, higher, how did it, become higher, when it completely changed the model, conventional wisdom of, going to the lesser markets first and emerging markets, and then going to the most developed markets. So higher, they went first to the most developed markets, and then they came back. So it's a completely new philosophy of management, non-Western perspective. So is it important for students of, MBA students in IIMs and other management schools also to understand that this is a non-Western way of looking at things, and this is also something which they should be exposed to? And I asked them, has this course been taught to you people earlier? They said, no. This is a celebrated case. Do you know how Huawei has become what it has? Do you know, Google with, Google's problems in China? So you complete an MBA course, 10 years back, perhaps I will still give you the benefit of doubt. But today, you are not exposed to some of the most celebrated cases on Chinese management practices, and you are completing your MBA. And that is something which is unfathomable. And what are we doing about it? Nothing. So, again, sorry, I'll take another minute or two. Okay, there was a time when, there was this debate. I'm again sorry to bring in back business ethics. There was this debate that business ethics should be compulsory or optional. Then, due to accreditation and various other things, people said, no, it should be compulsory. Once it was decided that, business ethics education is compulsory in B schools all over the world in management education. Then the next question was, is it going to be a standalone course, or is it going to be part of the other, an essential module as part of the other subjects? So what I feel that perhaps, if we are, if many of the people, many of the educational institutions in their own places are hesitant, they think that China doesn't deserve to have a standalone course in their programs, at least they should ensure that their faculty, whatever core courses they teach, at least they should necessarily have one module or two which focuses on China. If you are doing a science and tech degree in the undergrad or postgrad, whatever it is, you need to basically tell students what China is doing there, how it has become what it has become. If you are doing management, then again, you need to tell them what are the Chinese business lessons in management, which they, which has contributed to the world of management, and how our knowledge is incomplete. We are doing injustice to our students because when they go out and competing in the larger world, people from other parts of the world are already coming equipped with that kind of a knowledge. So how does the leadership inspire, the internal stakeholders and, to mobilize them to understand the relevance of this? This is very critical. So that's what I want to say.
Yes, because actually when we are talking of China studies, as you say, there's both this issue of, bringing the Chinese experience into the various, disciplines or fields of study, as well as what we were talking earlier with Tansen, that is of, actually producing that crop of scholars that generates scholarship on China here. I mean, all of this is covered, and you can't say one is important, the other is not important. Both are important. Actually, we do have questions in the chat box. So I am this is the last round, and I would like you to really be brief, because otherwise we will not be able to have any questions, which is, again, coming back to give me one point. If you had to say one thing which could be done from where we are now, which would help, or which would really sort of help the development of Chinese studies here, what one thing would you point to? Let me start again with Sonika, and then we'll come around again.
I think a lot of these points have already been made, but to make it in a succinct way, study of China has to move into multidisciplinary university departments. It cannot function the way it is functioning now, because that study is dominated by a particular set of concerns. So it needs to broaden. And because of the nature of the institutional support today that exists in China studies today, there are certain specific hurdles in pursuing China studies. One of this is, don't tie the study of China to episodic happenings in the bilateral relations. Don't make access to China or bilateral access beholden to that. Make sure that there is enough funding, there is enough access for repeated fieldwork opportunities for the same scholars, same set of scholars over a period of time who want to pursue this seriously. And I think this is something ICS is very well placed to address, because we do have an understanding of the challenges that scholars of China studies face when the downturn in relations happens. And I think there's somewhere this has got internalized as well. And Professor Madhavi, you spoke about it. To study China is not to be a China apologist.
Yeah.
There was a very interesting chat. There was a very interesting comment in the YouTube chat box. I was looking at it, a comment box, that, it's almost like equating studying China with inviting an invasion from China. I think we have to understand that there are institutional factors that have actually systematically built in this mistrust. Until we recognize that this actually hampers the study of China and better engagement with China, I don't think we can move beyond.
Okay, thank you. Venkat?
Yeah, very simple. Maybe I'm being over ambitious here. Maybe, something like UGC making it some kind of a guideline whereby they say that, you see, sinology is something which is inevitable now, it is indispensable. So therefore, depending on what kind of degree you're offering, there has to be necessarily in all the core courses, at least one China module for sure, in undergrads and postgrads. Don't demonize China studies. That's it.
Thank you. Tansen, last word with you.
I agree with what Sonika and Venkat have pointed out, but I'll point to another issue that I see in course of writing that article in JS I found is the quality of publications on China is troublesome. I think the quantity has increased tremendously, but the quality is lacking in many cases. And this, as an editor of China Report, Madhavi, the importance of peer review. I think that part is totally not there in India. So things get published that perhaps ought not to get published, but there is a benefit for peer review. You get the guidance and you get the feedback from established scholars. That's how you improve the scholarship. And I think if we are trying to develop China studies scholarship, I think a very strong peer review system has to be established. It has its problem, but I have benefited a lot from people who criticize my research or publications, and that feedback helps improve the quality of research the next time. I think we are getting to that stage as well, when there's a lot of publication, we don't know what to make of it unless we have a good peer review system. And I think it's good that China Report has emphasized that in the last few years.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there are some questions, a lot of comments, but also some questions in the chat box. Somebody had been asking about Yeah, there is a question from Rituja Ghosh to both Venkat and Sonika. Says, regarding the aspect of dualism as highlighted by Professor Venkat of acceptance and non-acceptance with respect to China and India and lack of anthropological interest as highlighted by Dr. Gupta, where does Tibet figure in the field of China studies in India? Okay, so Sonika, I think you're well placed to answer that. Yeah.
Well, actually, it's exact. The state of Tibet studies in India is in much more crisis than China studies itself, because, I mean, there's hardly a community that is doing the kind of research on Tibet that can pass off as academic research. There are two types of interests on Tibet. One is the study of Buddhism, and the other is within the field of China studies, which is to look at Tibet as a, very outmoded, this thing of the buffer state between India and China. And I think Tibet studies in India has not moved beyond this. And the reason I think is exactly the same. There is so little curiosity. And I'm raising this not because I know why there is so little curiosity. I'm raising this because I'm actually befuddled by why it is so. And Tibet studies, in fact, there was a recent news report which said Indian army will now look towards Tibetology to combat, counter, or be more effective towards China. And I think that just is an example of the problem. I mean, that is not, to my mind, a solution. The securitization of academic research is the beginning of leading research down path-dependent dead ends. And as academics who have worked within these structural constraints, I think we all should have a sense of the fact that India, it's not a question of resources, it's not a question of quality of people, it's not a question of quality of output if people are given opportunities and if people take those opportunities. I think the problem is that we don't sufficiently engage with the fact why we want to study a particular country and its society, economy, and politics. And I think we could have more fundamental discussions on that.
We have a question from Patricia here, which is related to what Tansen was talking about at the end, but it specifically asks, do foreign academics journals take Indian China studies scholars seriously, except as informants on bilateral relations or as instruments of comparative studies? Tansen, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, yes, if in that article, I pointed out how the scholarship on China, India has increased tremendously in the last 5 years, if you do just a search. And the journals are published. If you look at Journal of Asian Studies, for example, in the last 5 years, they have published tremendously important articles on India, China, and none by Indian scholars, scholars based in India, it seems. But other journals are publishing also on India, China. In fact, we are doing a special issue on the methods in China-India studies for the International Journal of Asian Studies, also comes out of Cambridge. There's a demand. The issue is number of articles that I have reviewed, I have not recommended them for publications because they fall short. And I think that's the issue. But I think it's worth trying. Madhavi used to tell me that in China Report, when the peer reviews came up with lots of suggestions, the authors would then decline to revise it. I don't think that's the way to go. I think doing peer reviews takes a lot of time, and the suggestions are really constructive suggestions. And I think young scholars should take that as suggestion to improve their scholarship. And that's how it will improve. And I'll throw this back to Madhavi to answer that, because as an editor, you must have seen this. You are getting articles that are China, India, or China related that needs improvement, and they could be published with the improvements that's been suggested. So I think, Madhavi, if you want to say something about it.
I think that was one of the most frustrating aspects of being editor, which is that getting an article which had some potential in it and getting 2 good peer reviews with suggestions, but quite often, too often in the case of our Indian scholars who wrote these articles, they would either not get back at all or, basically would not know how to incorporate the suggestions. It would be like, because I think that has a lot to do with our Indian examination system, where you either pass or you fail, right? So par or fail ho gaya is the, idea when you get, and the comments would be sometimes pages long, and people go into paralysis when they get those comments. So I think something that supervisors need to do when they encourage their students working with them to send articles to peer-reviewed journals is that the first step is that you will have to take the reviews and
Can I say something regarding this?
Pardon?
May I say something regarding this?
Yes, sure.
I think much before people begin to publish, we need to address the issue of what is being written in PhD theses. I'm sure all of us have, reviewed thesis in the last few years, and it is distressing to see that the theses are not, forget the quality, the concerns are exactly the same as they were 20 years ago. People are still writing about Deng Xiaoping's foreign policy. People are still, and with the same kind of descriptive secondary sources kind of approach. And this is what I think is despairing, to see that in last 20 years, when you have seen a lot more interest in China, in a popular interest as well, you have seen many people placed in good universities who have trained in India partly and then gone abroad, doing very valuable work outside within India as well. It's not translating into training the next generation of PhD students at all. So then it is not surprising that the R&R process is something that people are not at all competent to handle. I think there is a massive sweeping under the carpet of the fact that our PhD programs are not academically sound. Because people take admission, we have to then make sure that they complete their degrees. I think this is what is happening. And it's quite apart from the language training part of it. It's quite apart from, the fact that, we don't have access to resources or to China, to go to China to do field work. I think this is something that is reflective of the fact that what do we consider research in our PhD programs? What passes as research? There is
I think that's a very important point. If you remember, I had mentioned that we should be looking at what people are actually writing to see the quality of China studies, and then go back and see what's missing. I think Sonika's point is quite important. MPhil and PhD theses should be looked at and see what are the shortcomings. Unless we do that, I think we can't go back and address. We think it's the language issues, the sources issues, but they will be clearly visible in the MPhil and PhD theses. And so when I see them coming to journals or for book publications, it's very, very, very clear. It's something that comes from graduate training rather than somebody doing it afterwards. So I think that's the stage again. If we are really looking at the standards of China studies, what kind of MPhil and PhD theses are being produced is something we have to be very, very concerned about.
But is that something to do with what we were talking about earlier, the lack of connect with other disciplinary subjects? Because for instance, history department theses, I'm not that I've had but for instance, a history department in some of these big universities, some of them produce really excellent work by Indian scholars on India, for instance. And they go through quite a rigorous kind of, it's not just that anything gets accepted, but when it comes to China studies, maybe less rigorous standards are applied. Is that the case? Would you think, Tansen? Or?
Yeah, I don't know about how the MPhil and PhD theses actually work. I mean, usually in the US, we have at least 3 or 4 people reading the theses, and then there's an outsider from elsewhere also commenting. But that process should be taken seriously. I don't know if it's taken seriously. The idea is not to pass everybody, but to improve the quality of the theses. I have no idea if that takes place, because in the US, there are a number of times you don't pass the qualifying exams or even the thesis defense. I don't know how common that is in India, but I see Partho is asking if we need a panel of mentors. I think we need a panel of mentors at that stage, if Sonika is right about an earlier problem before they actually get to the publication stage. I think maybe that should be strengthened to see that, you know, the MPhil theses and the PhD theses are actually meeting some kind of quality. And it can be from other disciplines, but especially the East Asian Studies, China Studies program, they are churning out lots of MPhils and PhDs. I think it would be nice to look at the quality and give them guidance. It's not that they are bad. I think they need some guidance, and
Yeah,
that's where the PhD
need the training.
We had ICS has been having some research methodology workshops, and one of them, which I participated in 3 years ago, we literally captured, about a dozen people who wrote reasonably passable. I mean, articles which had potential. I would say that's what we shortlisted them. And then, with the help of Shivnadar University, which was the host, we literally captured them for 3 days. We did not, we made them rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. And each person had one mentor with them all the time. Like, they were either from Shivnadar, some of the professors, or some of us from ICS. And, except for like an initial thing, the main thing was they got comments on their article. Then we literally sat and in different rooms, and they sat and rewrote, and then that revised version was looked at, and then they were given comments again. Because we felt that the real problem was this reluctance or inability to rewrite and rewrite, which is very important. So anyway, I mean, these are things that have to be tried, even given whatever the academic MPhil, PhD things. Still, things can be done, I think, which will help to improve the quality. I think we will have one more question here, which is quite different, so we can move away. There's one from Devraj Ghoshal. How can scholars and professors interested in China collaborate for ideas and multidisciplinary research? Can there be a monthly forum or WhatsApp group or whatever? So any of you want to address this? Venkat?
Yeah, I think Santosh has already responded to him. I know Devraj is a very good friend. He's also doing some good work in SP Jain Institute of Management. So I'll connect to him offline and I'll tell him. But for others also who would like to know, we have a WhatsApp group which has migrated to Signal now. So we have many scholars there, all the China watchers who keep on posting the latest developments on various fronts. And as far as China journals are concerned, we have the China Journal from ANU, Journal of Contemporary China from Princeton, China Report from our own ICS. These are the things which come to mind immediately, but there are many more. Depends on what is our focus of research. Every journal has got its own focus. So depending on what your article is all about, we are supposed to send and align our research with the objectives of that particular journal.
Sonika, anything about this? How one can collaborate and have?
I think we already have a lot of institutional mechanisms for collaborations. I think the annual conference, the ICS annual conference itself, could incorporate some of the things that we have discussed now, in terms of, like, for example, maybe plan a special issue of the journal once a year around the annual conference, and task a set of people with training students, not just towards the conference, but through the year to actually producing very high quality papers. So the process should start, like not a few weeks or a few months before like it does now, but a couple of years before, and plan for a couple of years ahead, because ICS has to take, I think, some kind of a leadership role in this. And China Report is considered to be, a journal that is now moving in the correct direction in terms of the way it's looking at peer review, etc. So I think we have to, and I think one thing which I wish it would happen, I don't know how to make it happen, is I wish it would happen is that scholars, Indian scholars who write on China would look at Indian journals as well as places to publish in. I know it's not very professionally rewarding, but maybe this is one way to make sure that Indian journals have the benefit of good peer reviews, good editorial board. So I know this is not an easy thing to do, but this is something I wish would happen.
I would like to just conclude with, I think because we're really nearing the end of our time, but a couple of things. One is in this pandemic era, in pandemic times, and we're also getting so used to coming online.
Right.
I mean, in some ways, this is a setback to regular teaching and regular interactions and all that. But in other ways, a lot of us from far-flung parts, far-flung institutions and all into more regular contact with each other. I mean, we could see this in our ICS Wednesday seminars, which now have quite a wide circulation. And, there are seminars going on and you meet people, and also people abroad. Now Tansen is there. I mean, he doesn't have to fly to India every time, he can participate. So, this is, one possibility of more, online collaboration, more online, like you have these networks forming. So this is something which can possibly be developed and not taken as some exceptional period. And as soon as we are free of the pandemic, we all go back into our little cubby holes. I mean, this is something which we can think of.
Madhavi, if I can just add to that, ICS can't do everything on its own. Fortunately, Ashoka is coming up with its China Studies program, and we have placed a couple of good people in Ashoka. So my suggestion to both Barnali and Nirmola was to work with ICS to develop this kind of collaborative research. I think in our process of identifying postdocs for Ashoka, there were a number of people who needed guidance. I think Justin is here. Justin's work is really, really good. I think these younger scholars should get into that network. And what Ashoka is doing in collaboration with Howard Yenching is quite important to develop the network that ICS has started. But I think more than one institution should be responsible for this kind of collaboration. And I'm very happy that Ashoka as a private institution is taking steps with that. There are issues with public institutions with the disciplinary focus, not doing interdisciplinary. I think Ashoka doesn't have that issue, but some of the people now recruited by Ashoka and now being sent to other institutions will create that kind of a network that you are talking about, Madhavi.
Okay, that's a positive development. I was a little surprised that in this whole discussion, nobody has raised issues of lack of money, lack of funds, maybe because we don't have anybody to tell that to here. Maybe if Srivastava had been here, we would have all, as somebody from the government, we could have all asked that, China Studies needs money, which I don't see there's any way you can really get around that, because, and especially if, avenues for collaborating with Chinese academics are going to become narrower in this period because of the downturn, then we really need the input from the Indian government to help that. But anyway, that is something that came through when we were doing the survey, that nobody was happy, except in a very few instances, that they had enough facilities or enough resources to for the students. But anyway, I just wanted to flag it because it's always an issue. Anyway, I think I would like to thank everyone here for their participation. I have found it personally.
One thing,
really, yes, Venkat, you want to say something?
Yeah, Madhavi, this is something which, in the previous conferences off the record, we used to have this small conversation. Now, one of the ideas of taking this to various regional centers was get some of the young people, understand about China. Unfortunately, great effort has gone, but due to the timing of the conference when it was being scheduled or something, most of the times these conferences have ended up as an exercise where already people who are doing China, they are talking to each other. What about the involvement with the people, I mean the young students there? So if the timing doesn't allow, I think wherever these conferences are being organized, we should have a set of people who are interested in China studies and have a 3 to 4 day kind of a event where these young students are given some kind of a certificate and exposed to China related developments in their own area of expertise. So, and it can take place in any part of the year, when there is summer or when there is winter vacation or when there is some other small break. So ICS and the host institution and maybe some other collaborators, they can all come together, identify experts in those particular areas, and make them talk to these few set of people. And if, this is like influencing the influencers, these young students who will go on and becoming managers, technocrats, they will understand and perhaps, they will be able to appreciate. You just have to ignite some kind of a spark in them at the right time. So that is something which, ICS annual conference is not being able to address properly. This is something which I seriously recommend should happen from next year onwards. I mean, Shantiniketan has got loads of China exposure, but that's not the case with others. So I think we should seriously consider ICS, in talks with the host institution. Think of doing something like this.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the suggestion. This is something that can be considered by thinking of the next and future conferences. I just want to say that, we are at the end of our time, and there were a lot of comments I find in the chat box. So even our panelists may like to go through them. And there's a lot of discussion about what is there, what is not there, what we should do. But I think we have covered a fairly wide range of issues from, what we were just discussing now, collaboration and other kind of things, to what we started with, right, with Sonika, which is the way we approach Chinese studies and the I'm unmuting it. Okay. So anyway, I think I was muted. So maybe that's a sign that we should end this session and start another one. Thank you all. I'm apologize if more of the discussion in the chat box could not be reflected in this. Thank you very much, all of you. And
thank you,
ma'am. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
Bye, Sonika.
So
bye, Venkat.
Bye, Venkat.
Yeah. Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
Professor.
Bye, Professor Tansen, Professor
Thank you.
Sonika. Yeah, thanks, ma'am. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. I would request all the participants to remain logged in for our next session at 3:45 p.m.